You are listening to the Neurocareers, Doing the Impossible podcast with Dr. K, episode number 25. Dear Neurocareers podcast listeners, today we continue to explore the interconnection between art and science, specifically the connection between art and neurotechnologies. I'm honored to introduce today's guest, Daniela de Paulis, a former contemporary dancer and a media artist exhibiting internationally. Daniela is an author of the Mare Incognito project, which won an Art of Neuroscience 2022 award. The culmination of this project was a live performance during which the brain activity of deep sleep is transmitted into space in real time. Welcome, Daniela. It's wonderful to have you today in our podcast. Can you please briefly introduce yourself and also tell us where you are joining us from?
Thank you, Milena, for having me. I'm very honored to be part of your podcast series. I think you're doing a wonderful work trying to bring neuroscience to newer generations as well. I'm a media artist. As you mentioned, I work with the combination of radio technologies and electroencephalogram technologies. And I'm currently at the Green Bank Observatory in West Virginia. I'm collaborating with a team of radio astronomers at the Green Bank Telescope, and we are working on my next project, which is going to be presented in February-March 2023. So for now, I will mention Mare Incognito. And this project has been also a long-term project. We started it conceptually already in 2017. Like all my projects, sometimes it takes years before the idea is implemented. Sometimes the technology requires a lot of development. And in the case of Mare Incognito, eventually the wait really paid off. So delay in the project also allowed me to find some amazing collaborators at the University of Cambridge, the Donder Center in the Netherlands also. And we used the square kilometer array, which is one of the newest generation radio antennas, to send my brain activity of deep sleep into space while sleeping. So this is just one step in my ongoing work on radio technologies and neuroscience.
Thank you so much, Daniela. That's a beautiful introduction, and I'm already curious to know more and about new project and, of course, Mare Incognito. Before we get to that part, I would like to ask you, where did everything start? Because our podcast listeners are students who want to pursue different careers, and they're just starting to discover themselves, their interest, and how they can implement this in neurosciences or in general in sciences, how they can connect art if they're interested with science, and so on and so forth. So can you tell a little bit about your career path? How did you become an artist? How did you become interested in neuroscience? And did you see this already coming when you were just a little girl, when you were growing up?
No, not at all. I had no knowledge of neuroscience until maybe 10 years ago. And I've always been interested in astronomy since a young age, but I never pursued the study of astronomy in depth. I always felt more inclined towards artistic subjects. So my background is very much in the tradition of visual arts. I studied painting. I also studied contemporary dance. So as an artist and as a performer, I've always been interested in space. So space is really the main topic of my work. It used to be the stage of the theater, and then became urban space, the space of the cities, the space of the ocean, I also worked with projects across the seas. And then eventually I ended up working with outer space and inner space. So combining, creating a poetic resonance between outer space and inner space. And this is what I've been doing for the past maybe 10 years, when I started with a project called the Cogito in Space. So in Cogito in Space, we send into space the brain activity of people who watch a film of the Earth seen from space. And the participants sit on a reclining chair. They watch a film of the Earth seen from space through a virtual reality headset. And we wanted to send the brain activity of people going through this experience into space in real time. So we worked on this project for 5 years before we managed to implement it exactly the way we wanted it to be. When I started working on this project, virtual reality was not ready for commercial. In 2013, it was still a developing technology, and also mobile electroencephalogram in 2013 was still not optimized for the type of use we wanted to make of it. And eventually the breakthrough in the project happened around 2015, when I started a conversation with a company in Austria that produces these lab-grade devices with 32 electrodes, which is also portable. And that was the moment when we realized we could do that. So we had a portable EEG device. We could finally use a commercial version of the VR headset, and we managed gradually to implement this idea and to have people going to a radio telescope in the Netherlands for sending their brainwaves into space using this large antenna, which really gives a sense of communicating with the cosmos. So the whole point of this project was to create a very intimate connection between the subject, the participant, and outer space. So to use these radio transmissions as a way to create a direct connection between inner space and outer space, and actually somehow suggest that there is no real division between what is out of our body and our mind and what is inside our body and our mind. So the two spaces are much more penetrable between each other than we think. There was a lot of philosophical research behind it on the extended mind thesis, for example. This is a thesis that was developed in the 90s and suggests that somehow the mind has the ability to change its environment at much greater extension than we think. So we typically think of the mind as something which is encapsulated in our body, and whereas the extended mind thesis suggests that as humans we can really generate a lot of changes also by thinking of the mind as something much more extended. So, for example, I think outer space technologies or the internet technologies really provide a very good example of that. We see how the human mind can really have a much greater reach once you pair that with technologies that can reach a global scale or even a cosmic scale, like, for example, space probes or radio transmissions. So this was also a way to explore the limits of the human body, the human mind, and really try to question the extent of our actions and the ability to imagine ourselves somehow traveling into space beyond the limit that we are typically perceiving as terrestrial beings.
Thank you very much, Daniela. That's a beautiful approach, and it includes and art and philosophy and science. So many different dimensions in it. I'm curious again from the viewpoint of a person who is developing his interests in the career. What motivated you to explore space? What was that interest that was coming from within that was calling you to develop projects and work in this domain?
I'm not sure if there is a specific answer to that. It's just as it is often the case when making a career decision or eventually embarking on a career path. Often it is a series of a combination of desires. And for me, I've always been very interested in experimenting, in really pushing the boundaries also of artistic expression, of artistic presentations. So, for example, the limits of the art gallery for me has always been very restrictive. So I've always looked for ways to question the very essence of art and how do we present art? What is the language of art? So I remember that when I started doing this type of work with outer space in 2009, even in the art world, there were some people who could not understand why I was using also scientific language in it. There was a much more defined definition between artistic and scientific realms. So I also encountered some resistance from the art world towards the kind of work I was making. But I really had this vision where I really wanted to experiment with language, also scientific language and scientific methodology. And I wanted to see how using these scientific methodologies, you could actually explore these very profound questions of human nature, of our existence. And then when you really expand these questions of existence, of life in general, eventually you relate yourself with the cosmos. That becomes immediately, I think, an interlocutor, if you like. You know, when we push the limit of our human understanding, that's where you meet the cosmos, which is the ultimate, I think, space where you, as a human, somehow realize the limit of your, just your presence on Earth and your knowledge, etc. So it is a very tangible type of space which immediately confronts human with our limited understanding, more than microscopic space. Of course, we know that the equivalent of outer space is microscopic space, if you like. And there is so much we don't know about, the way the invisible worlds work right in front of our eyes. As I'm talking to you, there is a whole hidden life in every object we touch, in everything we see, that is way beyond our perception. But somehow I think it is for humans, because the way we evolved as animals, once we look at the sky and we are immediately confronted with the cosmos, it is a much more physically direct confrontation than whatever happens in the microscopic world, which we simply have no direct awareness of.
Yes, absolutely. And this reminded me of something. I had a fear of being in dark places because I thought that there is somebody, that I cannot see. And what helped me when I realized that there is always something nearby, even if we're talking about microscopic bacteria, millions of different microorganisms everywhere and animals. And, there is so much around that you are never alone, that of course there is somebody nearby. And this is how I overcame my fear of darkness. So I love your explanation of really expanding the boundaries. That is beautiful, and you're exploring it through so many different ways. How did you overcome that resistance that you felt from the artist at that time when you started to implement scientific methodologies in your explorations?
I think for me, the desire to explore this path in artistic research was much stronger than the criticism that I encountered along the way. And science and art somehow they share a long tradition. So there are in the history of art and science, there has been always a number of artists and scientists who have been working together or who had expressed these two types of forms of knowledge through their work. So it's not something new, of course, but somehow it has become more mainstream in the past few years, and now it is much more accepted by both fields, if you like. So also nowadays to collaborate with scientists is not as strange as it used to be. So it has become more, if you like, normalized, as it should be. It is really a great way for both fields to explore the limits of each form of knowledge, the artistic knowledge and the scientific knowledge, by comparing these two forms of knowledge, making, I think, you really reach some very interesting results. So for me, it really was more like the artistic vision that led me, and I wasn't particularly afraid or sensitive to the criticism, but I was really, I felt like the topic I was exploring was very interesting to me, and that was really the main leading force.
Yes, we talk about this in our podcast, that passion for exploration, for exploring your idea. This is what brings you forward no matter what. So it definitely was very strong in you. When you just started this exploration of scientific approaches when used with the artistic expressions, what were the main challenges for that transition to start using scientific methods?
The main challenge was at the beginning familiarize with the scientific language, learning this way of defining phenomenon, reality. So in art, we have a completely different way to describe even the same phenomena. So it was very at first challenging to look at something in a very descriptive way, in a very, if you like, objective way. So familiarizing with the language, with the methodology, with how scientists look in a very focused way at a particular question, whereas in art, everything is much wider. You immediately have a syncretic perception, understanding of things. So it was difficult to zoom in and out, to embody like the mind of a scientist while also keeping this form of creative, more, if you like, organic approach towards the topics that we were exploring. I think it can be tricky sometimes when you work with scientists to really, I developed eventually a language to explain what I do to scientists, to explain why for me it is valuable to send my brain activity into space. So I had to develop a way of describing my work that could also make the idea compelling to scientists, because otherwise, if the idea is not compelling to them, you cannot establish any collaboration. So I would say for any artist or scientist who wants to work in this transdisciplinary field, it's very important to understand how the other party communicate and try to also explain your message in a way that can convey a very interesting idea in a way that is maybe is not maybe completely familiar to you.
Yes. So basically, learning each other's language. Yes.
Absolutely.
That is very important when we're trying to work with different fields. Yes, like art and science and other disciplines. Beautiful. I'm glad that you were able to learn that language and made so wonderful projects. What became available to you when you started integrating science in your projects that wasn't maybe available or possible before that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say that I don't have an answer to that. It is something that I keep questioning. along while I keep developing this work. So for sure, the technology I have access to has allowed me to expand my artistic language into dimensions that I would never have imagined before. So at the moment, I'm collaborating with the largest steerable radio telescope in the world. And there is no way I could have done that if I didn't seek this collaboration with scientists. So for sure, the possibility of using instruments that are not just the computer, digital videos or media that I was using before working with scientists. So the access to laboratory grade devices, these very sophisticated devices that can look at reality with great precision and with a lens that you wouldn't otherwise have as an artist working in your own studio. So for sure the technology, but also conceptually over the years I really cleared a lot of sometimes misunderstandings about things that you can have as a non-scientist. So in my work, I try to be very thorough also when it comes to science. So when I explain to people that they're sending into space their brain activity, I really want that to be an accurate message. I don't find it interesting to give people the feeling that they are going through an experience which is only imaginary. For this reason, I wanted to work with lab-grade devices that really can produce that type of experience. And typically, people really appreciate that. So when you tell them that what they're going through is an actual recording of brain activity and it's not just a fictional event, they really appreciate that. They really understand the difference between an imaginary event and a real experience. So that, first of all, makes a big difference. So a particular decision as an artist was really to aim for using science as a tool at the highest possible level. So for me, it's really the material of my work. It's like choosing the fabric of your work. And I wouldn't want this fabric to be just of, a quality I wouldn't be happy with. So I really see that the science for me is just for a painter, the color, the particular type of oil paint would be. And so that's the first realization I made as an artist. But of course, for every artist, this is very different. I know there are artists who use, for example, commercial, very simple EEG devices, which suggest the idea of recording a brain activity, but in fact, it is mostly recording of facial noise and muscle noise, etc. So, it is up to the artist to use the tools in a way that most fits the artistic message you want to convey.
Yes, absolutely agree with you. And this is a beautiful explanation. You are using tools and certain materials, and you want them to be perfect. Yes, the best possible for your expression. I also understand that you needed to acquire some technical skills while transitioning into using science to support your art. I noticed reading about you that you are a licensed radio operator. I was very curious about that. Can you tell a little bit more about what did you need to acquire and a licensed radio operator? How did it happen and how it helps you as well?
Yes, it helps a lot because I started from, let's say, a more amateur level of science, which is amateur radio. So amateur radio is gradually led me to work with professional radio astronomers. So initially, I was collaborating with radio amateurs who are very technically minded people, and they use radio technologies in a very playful way. And that was a very interesting experience. But that is where I started learning the basic language. So it's like the basic driving, learning about radio waves, electromagnetic spectrum, frequency, power, antennas, all these words continuously popping up as part of my daily work as an artist. And then it became quite natural for me at some point after a few years just to eventually get a license as a radio operator, which is, the license to operate a radio antenna. So I just took an exam. I'm Italian, so I took the exam in Italy. And the course essentially teaches you the basics of radio technologies. And that was very helpful. But now I don't work with radio amateurs any longer, so I don't use my license anymore. I work with radio astronomers, and the type of instruments they use are way too sophisticated for me to really use them directly. I rely on their help to use them. But still, the language is very similar. So radio transmissions, frequency, again, electrical signals, all these words are basic language.
Yes, absolutely. And probably this is what helped you also to transition fairly smoothly into field of electroencephalography and neurotechnologies in general, because it's all about frequencies and electrical signals. So you were already ready for that transition. Can you tell a little bit more about how it happened and what was your first project with the electroencephalography, maybe in more detail?
The first project I developed where I used electroencephalogram was Cogito in Space. So in 2013, I was already working on this idea. And I consider myself a conceptual artist. So typically, I come up with an idea, sometimes can be very challenging from the technical point of view, but the vision is really what leads the whole project and the entire team. So as long as the idea is strong and clear, I'm confident that I can bring the team together and really lead the team towards this objective. So I was already working with radio operators back then, and I had this idea of sending into space the brain activity of people watching this film in virtual reality. And I had no idea how to do it. I didn't know anything about electroencephalography. All I know is that you could record the brain activity with these devices, but it was all very much learning while making the project. So because also as an artist, I work with other people, I collaborate with other people. One of the most challenging part of this project was to find the right collaborators. So a team of people who could do all the tasks that the project required. In particular, we were looking at converting the brain activity from these 32 electrodes into a sound that we could send into space in real time. So just speaking with many people, neuroscientists from different institutions, et cetera, eventually I met a team of people who does exactly that. So this team of people, of neuroscientists, work with artists to convert the brain activity into a sound. And that was really a breakthrough in the project. So there is several layers of work. There is the human aspect. So the collaborators are really the most important part of the whole project. Without the right collaborators, there is no way you can learn about something new. And you cannot implement something so challenging. So I would say if you have a strong idea, and even if you don't have skills, that is not a problem. You need to look around for people who can help you to gain those skills, understand what you need to do, and who can really, if they like the idea, if it's a synergy, it's a collaborative work. So you learn while doing. The same way I've learned about neuroscience, about electroencephalography, just by doing the project, essentially.
Learning by doing is one of the most powerful ways actually to learn something. So you are using best approaches, even from a neurocognitive perspective. Yeah. Collaboration, of course, is very important, and we talk about this in our podcast. And I remember one of our first podcasts with Dr. Christoph Guger. Probably this is the amplifiers that you work with. We talked about collaboration because Dr. Guger collaborates, I think, with the whole world, and that is a very big strength. This is how we can achieve so many things. So beautiful that you are mentioning that and how it helps in projects. So what was the main outcome of the Cognito in Space?
The outcome was, how can I explain? It is difficult to, I think, define because my projects really don't have one particular outcome, like when you show something in the gallery only, if you just, it is a choice, really artistic choice. You can, as an artist, you decide to present your work in the gallery, like have a painting in the gallery, and that's one way to present your work. For me, typically I combine gallery presentations to a whole series of other types of dissemination. So, for example, we wrote several academic papers about this project. We also recorded several interviews, and I presented it in many conferences, both about science and art. So I also talk with people like yourself who are from the neuroscience field, as well as people from the arts. And that is really, in my opinion, a great way to disseminate your work in ways that has a much greater resonance, because more people can become interested in what you do and can really become inspired by this type of work. Just like now, for example, I give talks for the radio astronomers. Although the type of work I do is not something they will do in their daily research job, still, I think I like to think that gives them also a different perspective on the type of work they're making. In my opinion, an artwork has a lot more potential than just aesthetic and artistic fruition. It can really have also a greater social value than that.
Yes, definitely. It creates an impact. And again, when you at the beginning were talking that you want to push boundaries, to expand boundaries, you are also helping to expand boundaries for other people as well with this project. The one more outcome that this project had, that it led to a next project, Mare Incognito. Yes, so can you tell more about that project? This is the latest project that you've done, and that received an important recognition already, and received an Art of Neuroscience 2022 award. So if you can tell more about it.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, there is a very strong continuity between Cognito in Space and Mare Incognito. And it's really the two projects that are strongly linked. For me, while I was working on Cognito in Space, I was thinking about what could be the most intimate way to connect the individual with the cosmos. And I thought it would be great to use a radio telescope, which is typically used for scientific research, as an instrument to send into space the human experience during which we are most vulnerable, which is the moment of falling asleep and deep sleep. That is the moment where, as humans, we are most vulnerable. And it is the moment when we completely forget about ourselves. All our daily narrative shuts down. We forget about who we are. Our body freezes. We don't move anymore. We enter this sort of dark space, this space of unknowing. It is a moment of great freedom, if you like, because we really overcome the story that we create in our mind about ourselves, about life. I was very fascinated by this philosophical idea. And this is something which I've always experienced since as a small child already. I felt this attraction and also fear at the same time for the moment of falling asleep. I knew it was a moment where I wasn't myself anymore. And as a child, it was also quite frightening to fall asleep. And eventually I learned quite a few people actually experience this fear of falling asleep. And I can see why. Philosophically and artistically speaking, I think this moment of falling asleep and deep sleep have really that quality of unfathomable space, which really it's difficult to describe in human words, this sense of lack of boundaries. And I thought that this inner space that we enter during deep sleep resonates with the cosmos, the emptiness, the infinity of the cosmos. So I wanted to create this type of a connection between these two spaces. It is something quite difficult to describe by words. For me, while we recorded this performance, while I was sleeping next to the radio antennas at the Muller, the Radio Astronomy Observatory, it was night. I was in the outdoors. I was sleeping on a reclining chair with a sleeping bag. For me, the experience of falling asleep under the stars and knowing that my brain activity was being transmitted into space during that moment was really a very transformative experience, was quite a mystical experience, which I remember even when I woke up. I really felt that I went through something really profound that I wish other people could also experience that. The feeling of somehow having yourself blending in with something much greater than yourself. This experience is a very physical experience because radio waves are also very physical. So it's not just an abstract idea.
Yes, that's beautiful. And you answered in a way my question, because I was curious, how was it even to sleep with transmitting your brain waves? So you said that it was very transformative. Was it really easy to fall asleep? Were you not anxious about what's going on? Because it's absolutely different, yes, and you're under the stars. It's not doesn't happen every time. Yes, and you have electrodes on your head. So how was even that process of falling asleep? How did it work for you?
Yes, that's the main challenge of that event was, in fact, falling asleep. It was actually very cold. So probably that was the main problem. It was a very cold night in March last year. And I was not afraid, or the team I was working with, including the filmmakers, including the scientists, really, we created this wonderful working environment and collaboration that I felt completely safe to sleep even in the middle of this field at night, knowing that there are also animals roaming around. So that was not a particular concern of mine. But of course, the cold was a problem. And then eventually, when I felt asleep, that made me really think about sleep in performance art, how it is represented in performance art. So you can either act the action of sleeping. So, for example, in a film or in a theater piece, you can have a person simulating the act of sleep. But when you work with electroencephalogram, you know when that is actually happening or not. And the scientists were actually able to point that out to me after waking up, that I was really in deep sleep at some point. They could tell from the recording of the brain activity. And that was actually really very interesting. So, yeah, and maybe this is not part of the answer, but I thought it might be interesting to mention that for me, this project was not about dreaming. So I wasn't particularly interested in the dream stage. And during this performance, in fact, I didn't go into any dream stage. I was really interested in this moment when we lose our awareness and our biographical narrative. And I wanted to have this moment of void, inner void and outer void, somehow dialoguing with each other.
Yeah, so you were more interested in experience and merging those worlds. Beautiful. So now that this project is completed, what's your next step? You already mentioned at the beginning that there is some new project that you are working on. Where are you going right now?
Yes, I cannot say much about this next project simply because it is part of the actual presentation, the fact that it has to be really a surprise. But also, I can say that I'm still working with radio technologies, and I'm continuing. Mare Incognito won the prize of Art of Neuroscience, is the first part of the project. And we are already working on a second part of the project, also in collaboration with GTech and Christoph Guger. And we have a really big plan for this follow-up event.
I'm already very curious about it. I hope we will meet after you present that project and you will tell us more about it. I read that you collaborated, at least on your brain-related projects, with the Donder Center in Netherlands and also University of Cambridge in UK. I'm familiar with Donder Center. I hear a lot about it because they're very famous for their magnetoencephalography research. So I'm specializing in magnetoencephalography, and that's why I know the work that they're doing very well. How is this interaction happening? How are they contributing to the project? What is the main contribution from centers like this to artistic projects like you are doing?
We started working on this project on Mare Incognito during the pandemic. So between 2020 and 2021, we had weekly meetings with scientists from the Donder Center and the University of Cambridge. So it was really a regular meeting. We only met in person, eventually only in September 2021. The main work was done online during this pandemic, so we could not do real sleep tests at the Donder Center. But that also was very good because it really allowed us to develop the conceptual part of the project. So by the time we met in person to carry out the technical tests, we already developed the concept really well. We were very well prepared as a team. So I think we really gained from each other a lot. For me, I really enjoyed to work with the people at the Donder Center and the University of Cambridge in this particular project because I noticed, especially neuroscientists, have a way of working which is very team-based, I noticed. There was no particular leader in the project. We were really all pretty equal. And that type of teamwork, actually, I never quite experienced it the same way before. I think what they probably enjoyed was to test their knowledge and technologies in an environment, in a context that is completely out of their comfort zone. So it was very challenging for them to develop the technical part of this project, but they really enjoyed it as well. So they appreciated the challenge, and all the staging of this idea, I think, was very interesting for them to just see how neuroscience can live in a context which is theatrical and philosophical, if you like.
Yeah. I think that's so good the way you said that it was beneficial for both parts and for you and for them, because it opens up neuroscientists for new possibilities and new applications of neuroscience, of neurotechnologies. This is a trend that I see that is happening right now, this merge between arts and sciences, art and neuroscience particularly. If we look into the future, let's say 50, 100, 200 years from now, because I saw in one of the articles that you were talking about the future, let's say 200 years from now. So if we go that far away, how do you see in general the science, the art, what would happen and what can happen if we continue this type of collaboration that we're starting right now?
Wow, that is really 200 years from now. I mean, it's very hard to imagine. I think neuroscience can give an insight on how we we experience life. Like, for example, I know there is a lot of interest around dreams, and dreams has a very iconic, very special place in art. And the possibility of visualizing dreams or somehow describing dreams to this type of devices, I think, is very appealing to artists because it sheds light on something that has been so extremely mysterious for, all our evolutionary history. So it is a way to make something unknown more visible, which is also something that art does. I don't know exactly how art and neuroscience will evolve in the next 200 years, but I see that these different types of knowledge are increasingly communicating with each other. So at some point, perhaps we will have a type of knowledge where, besides the specialist knowledge, we will have a lot more intersection amongst these various forms of knowledge. And also, I think in general, we will be able to use human intelligence at the global scale in a much more efficient way. So there are so many interesting, possibilities, if you like, if we found a way to harness the global intelligence, global knowledge in a way that it is actually really helping solving problems and tackle, these global issues. I think we have already the technical tools to do that. So maybe neuroscience and art could also be the catalyst for, using knowledge and science and global intelligence in a way that it's also helping to make radical changes in our world, which are much needed.
Absolutely. And maybe talking about what you said at the beginning, how it's important for you to expand those limits, to also remove boundaries. So this conjunction between science and art, neuroscience and art, can maybe facilitate removing boundaries between people, which I think is very important for a beautiful future environment in which we all live. One question I have about you being a member of IAA-SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Committee, and also you're a regular host for the WOW Signal podcast. So as a podcaster, I'm very curious about that. Can you tell a little bit, at least some glance into it to our listeners?
Yes, I've always been interested in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And eventually in 2016, I joined the Permanent Committee, which is a group of scientists who try to answer the question, are we alone, or what could another extraterrestrial civilization be like? So these are all very challenging questions, very far-fetched questions. But what I find really interesting about these group of scientists who work on searching for an extraterrestrial intelligence is that it is a very interdisciplinary group. So you cannot look for an answer to these questions if you don't use different points of view. So you need anthropologists, you need sociologists, you need artists, you need scientists, etc. So it is a very special type of science which really where interdisciplinarity is really necessary. And the Wow Signal podcast is a platform by a friend of mine called Paul Carr. He's a scientist, he's a NASA scientist, and he created this platform with the intention of hosting conversations amongst scientists, humanists, artists, trying to talk about science in an unconventional way. So also looking at the philosophical layers of science. So talking about the aspect of science that are not usually covered by scientific podcasts or scientific websites, for example. It is an interdisciplinary conversation, and we focus a lot on SETI, but also other topics.
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe our listeners also will want to listen to that podcast. So sounds very interesting. Your projects, like, for example, Mar Incognito, do you think they can contribute to that search of extraterrestrial life? And if so, what would be their contribution?
This is a good question because I typically don't use radio transmissions to communicate with an extraterrestrial intelligence. And I know that many people can interpret this attempt as a way to look for extraterrestrial intelligence. In my case, that is not the intention. So I don't target a particular planet, or usually when we transmit the brain activity into space, we keep the antenna still. So, which means that the signal spreads across the space, doesn't target any particular planet. But this is the core of actually the way I use radio transmissions in my work. So it's not so much a way of communicating as it would be if you were transmitting a message towards an extraterrestrial planet, but it is a way for, in this case, humans to really have a contact with outer space, which is more, if you like, philosophical, subjective. It really allows humans to access space in a way that is somehow transformative, that can produce an experience which can have, some open some philosophical questions on our human condition, if you like. So I see these radio waves as a medium which can rarefy the human mind and the human body into space in order to create some kind of questioning, some deeper understanding of who we are in relation to the cosmos. But there is also this dimension. So often when I present my projects, people think that this type of work is also a form of communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence. And that is completely fine by me. Of course, when you produce an art project or when you write a book, whatever you do, the art project has its own life. So anyone is, of course, going to interpret that in a different way. So there are, of course, interpretations around this topic. It is not my intention, although, of course, it's one of the possible ways to read this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a beautiful idea because it's not really limited by our consciousness, which is limited, which you are trying to expand, but just transmitting the brain waves, they're just brain waves. Yes, and all the complexity of the signal can be used for different purposes, which I think is very, very interesting approach in general. So thank you very much for this explanation. And another question is, we're already nearing the end of our podcast. And my question is, what was the most interesting finding for you working in this merge between the arts and science, and maybe specifically with neuroscience?
With neuroscience, I feel like there is so much more that I could explore, that I only touched the top of the iceberg. So for me, this is just the beginning of a great number of possibilities. So I think as long as you find a team, like in my case, I was very lucky to find this particular team at the Donder Center and the University of Cambridge that is willing to collaborate in a very egalitarian way. So we really work in a way that we are humble with each other. So they are very respectful of my work, of my perspective as an artist, as much as I am of their work and their perspective. So as long as you find collaborators of these kinds, you amplify your potential as an artist to the number of people you have in your group, because everyone, if there is a safe environment in the group, then everyone really brings their own ideas and their own intellectual contributions. So what you can do as a single artist or as a single researcher really becomes much greater, because you have access to this hive mind, and you can really see things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see, maybe within the limits of your experience.
Yeah, thank you very much. So again, we're going to the topic of collaboration and respectful collaboration with each other, which can amplify each individual or each individual idea manifolds. Thank you for noting that. Our podcast is called Neurocareers, Doing the Impossible. You already implemented something that wasn't possible before. You translated the brain data in deep sleep into space. which required a lot of preparation and work and teamwork. How do you make impossible possible? As an advice for those who are just thinking, sometimes maybe seemingly impossible projects, what would you advise them so that they would go ahead and make this impossible possible?
Talking from my experience, which might not necessarily be similar, identical or similar to someone else's experience, but talking from my point of view, when you have these challenging ideas, it's very exciting. So when I present these very challenging ideas, usually the scientists respond very positively because they also enjoy these challenges, and it is really providing a new field of exploration. So you have the strength that you can create a strong team when you have a strong proposal. A slightly, a challenging, a daring proposal is always very exciting for the team. On the other hand, in my experience, I really had to apply a lot of patience. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, my projects take years in the development. So what you see typically research that takes 4 or 5 years at least. Now I mentioned I'm working on a new project which has already been taking 3 years. And it's just really the minimum time you need to create something which is providing something new. So you need a lot of patience and time. And of course, you'll find a lot of obstacles. So it's important that the team is a united team, so you can also overcome the difficulties that you will encounter. So it is both exciting, challenging, and requires a bit of stamina as well.
Thank you. So, but it's interesting that you mentioned patience, especially in the long run, long-term projects. That is important. I think we haven't mentioned this in our previous podcast episode, so this will be something new and I think very important for people to hear. If some of the listeners that will be listening to this podcast, they're coming to the field of neuroscience from the field of art, what would be your recommendations for them to start entering the neuroscience field?
From the art point of view, I think there is not just one channel to enter the field of neuroscience. It really depends. You can do it. You don't necessarily need to collaborate with the neuroscientists to be able to work with neuroscience. There is already a lot of books that are accessible to the general public, or a lot of material online that you can already study and do research on and learn a lot about the brain, about neuroscience, and use it in your studio-based work as an artist. As a painter, you can already tell a lot about neuroscience by just reading about it. If you want to collaborate with a team of neuroscientists, that can become quite complex, because in my case, I also have to make funding applications, because you will start using expensive equipment. You will have to develop specific softwares. So it becomes very expensive once you want to implement a project with actual neuroscientific tools. So it also depends on the working context. That shouldn't be putting people off from actually working with neuroscientists in other ways. And you can, of course, always contact neuroscientists at universities. And typically, in my experience, they reply, they're willing to offer help. So already talking with specialists from this field is already very, very useful, and gives you access to a world that maybe is very different from the artistic world.
Thank you very much, Daniela. And my last question is, if our listeners want to learn more about the work you do, or maybe to get in touch with you, what would be the best ways for them to do that?
Many ways, I will say. So there is quite a lot of material online about my work. I recorded many talks in conferences. So there is a lot of recorded talks on YouTube. Also my website, danieladePaulis.com, or feel free to get in touch if you want to have a chat with me. That's always possible. Yeah, just maybe we can see if maybe our path cross in my near future. I will be traveling a little more to bring my projects to other countries. So also I hope you'll be able to see them in real life.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually personally look forward to seeing your projects in real life. So I will be on the lookout.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you so much, Daniela. That was an amazing conversation. A lot of thought work, I think, and for me, definitely, and for our listeners. So thank you. It was very, very enjoyable.
Thank you, Milena, for having me. It's been wonderful.